So today we are going to be talking about resumes. So resumes are important because it's kind of the first thing that you will submit to an employer when you fill out a job application, whether it's in person, online. This is usually the first thing that you're going to hand them and is kind of your first impression on who you are as a person, what your work experience is, and what you can offer the company that you're applying for. So just a brief outline of what we'll be talking about, just kind of the basics of what is a resume, some formatting basics on how you should kind of build it from scratch, the different sections that are usually contained in most resumes, and then some additional tips and advice on either building a resume or things to keep in mind as you go through the job search process. So what is a resume for? Ideally, it's a sales pitch for yourself. So this is one or two pieces of paper that just goes in and describes why you're good and why you're a good candidate for a particular job. So one of the best ways to do this is just kind of going through and listing who you are. So your name, all of your contact info, basics like that, what you've done. So education, your work experience, volunteer experience, anything that falls under that umbrella. And then how you meet your needs. And this is what we'll probably spend the most time on today is not just what have you done, but why is the things that you've done going to help you succeed and excel in the role that you're trying to get to. So I spend a lot of time in my classes highlighting like just a lot of time on building your resume in the first place. We're going to do a whole workshop in person or potentially online, depending on our arrangement. But I spend a lot of time honing in on this resume, editing it, and then I'm going to ask you to re-edit it in the future before we're done with the class. And there's reasons for that. So one of the biggest things is something called an applicant tracking system. So the bigger the company, the more likely it is that they're going to use something like this. A small place with 10 or 20 employees probably won't have something like this, but anywhere slightly bigger than that, or any sort of franchise that has multiple locations for a particular kind of business is likely to use this. And so this applicant tracking system assigns scores to every resume that it gets sent. And it assigns scores based on certain keywords that the company wants looking for, or a level of education or experience that they want. And so it's just a computer system that scans the resume for certain key pieces of information and says, hey, it has this information there, let's give it a positive score. Hey, if this information is missing, we're going to give it a lower score, and it's going to be lower on the pile of all the applications that are seen. So only the top percentage of submissions of resumes will actually be viewed by a human once it goes through this tracking system. So it's really important to make sure that when you're building your resume, you're typing in keywords and things like that, so you're not at the bottom of the pile. Here's some statistics I pulled from some websites from HR recruiting and things like that. 3 out of 4 resumes never actually see a human. They get auto sorted by this tracking system, or so they just get tracked out. They have low scores, and the recruiter, to save time, just looks at the top 20, top 10, top 20% of resumes and applications that come in. Again, this is an average, so if the bigger the company, the more people are applying for a job. So if you're applying to some place like Carl or Kraft or State Farm or something like that, your average pool of people applying for that job is going to be over 100. Recruiters only spend about 6 seconds looking at a resume, because they're looking at, again, probably hundreds a day. So they have it down to a science. They know what they're looking for and know how to skim that information very quickly. If you have a photo in your resume, do not do that. Over 80% of the resumes that have a photo or an unprofessional email that has like slang or nicknames or inappropriate content just gets thrown in the trash automatically. So first things, we'll start with the basics of kind of the formatting and how to start building your resume. So a lot of people tend to use their own templates that you can download online, you can download off Word. And while those are great for kind of building an idea of what you want it to look like, they can be hard to edit if you ever need to add or change things. The formatting doesn't usually like to play nicely when you add or remove things later. And also, all of these special graphics and tables and things like that that make it look nice when you print it out, the tracking system that we were talking about earlier is not going to always read the information right and can actually hurt your application because it's scanning the wrong boxes for the wrong information. There's some things on margins. If you want to fit in more on your page, uh, changing your margins from 1 inch to half an inch is a really good way to do that. You can change your spacing in some of the advanced options on Word. I highly recommend building your resume in Microsoft Word. And so I would set it to single and have 0 points of spacing before and after. Again, so you could fit a lot more on there and kind of fit more experience into one page. And also using an acceptable font. So all of the ones listed are there. Just something that's clean, easy to read, and professional. So here's kind of a menu of different places that you can look at to see the breakdown of where margins are, how to change your spacing, things like that on Microsoft Word. And you can always talk to me if you want to go into this in more detail. Okay, so now that we have kind of the basic build and margins and laid all the framework for what we're going to start typing, now it's time to actually start adding in information. So your header is going to be at the very top, and it's going to include all of your contact information so that the easiest way for the HR is just to look at the top. They remember your name, and they have all of your contact info right then and there. So you're going to put your name. It should be the largest thing on your application, and it's the first thing on your application. You're going to list your address. I would say best practice is probably just to do your city and state. They're going to assume that if you're applying for the job that you can get there. There's no need to list your specific street address because, again, depending on what neighborhood you live in, there might be some conscious or unconscious bias about people who live in a particular neighborhood. So just list the city and state that you're residing in for your address. Phone number, you definitely want to reach the phone number where you're most available to answer. So you want to list the one that you have on you most of the time, the one that has a voicemail box that's set up that you're checking regularly. Also, you want to list your email that you check. Again, you want one that you're checking the most often and also has like a professional name address. So you want, usually what most people do is some version of their name and initials, maybe a couple numbers if you have a common name, at Gmail or at Hotmail or something like that. Try to avoid nicknames, putting in your birth year, because they can, again, assume your age if you put in your birth year in there. So try not to give out any information about yourself in your email address. And if you're never have heard of LinkedIn, it's kind of like a Facebook profile meets your resume. So it's really a professional social media networking site that has a lot of opportunities. Usually it's more in the professional realm and more of the office businessy realm. So if you're doing like an entry level CNA, you probably don't need one. But if you're going into office work or IT work or somewhere in the business field, something like that, highly, highly, highly recommend that you start making a LinkedIn profile because a lot of employers are going to check that as the first thing after they look at your resume. Here are some examples of what a header might look like with your name, your contact info, etc. The next section that's usually on a resume is an objective or summary statement. And so it's just a short, brief explanation on why you are the best fit for this position. So a good summary or objective or overview is going to just be 1 or 2 sentences explaining why you're qualified for this specific job. One thing I always tell people is that your writing in your summary is going to be used to gauge your ability to write professionally. So this is part of the application of how well you write it, how clear you are, how good you are with English, writing things down, writing things clearly, using correct sentence structure, all of that. So I would highly recommend, if you're going to use a summary statement, that you have someone who's good with grammar, proofread it, and things like that, because the employer is going to judge you based on how you write it out. Also, be detailed in what you list there. So phrases like hard worker, fast learner, or willing to learn, those are a dime a dozen. Just about everyone who turns in a resume is going to say something like that. It's generic, and it doesn't tell the employer why you're a better fit than someone else. You want to highlight what you've done specifically that maybe someone else hasn't already done. So, tailor it to a specific job application. Highlight the things that are relevant for the job you're trying to go into. Do you need it? So I would say that there's two generally good times to include a summary section, and that is one, when all of your previous work experience is very different from where the industry you're trying to get to is. So if you've done like landscaping, physical labor jobs, and you're trying to get into an office job where you're sitting at a desk typing all day, you might want to give a short summary on why you're making that transition and acknowledge, like, hey, I know this is different, but there's a reason that I'm trying to switch from this seemingly unrelated field into a new field, because the employer is going to be thinking, why are you doing this? The other time you would include an objective is if you don't have a lot of experience and you have a lot of blank space on your resume. Then it would be good to elaborate more on your experiences and also kind of fill up the blank space so it looks like you have more experience when you're turning in that resume. So there's some example summaries on here of they're good, and then there's also the link provided below. So the first one is, an organized dental office associate with 7 years experience maintaining client schedules, billing policies, and workflows. So this is going into details of, hey, they've been an office associate. They have 7 years of experience and 7 years of experience in scheduling, in billing, and kind of knowing how an office works. So they're not just saying, hey, I've worked at a dentist office for 7 years and left it at that. They went into detail and described each of the different things that are relevant to probably the job that they're applying for. After the summary, I would say generally you can put your education next. So we're going to be talking about a particular kind of resume orientation, which is the standard, and it's going to be reverse chronological. So reverse chronological is going to be putting the most recent one first and the oldest last or on bottom. So that way, your employer can see the most relevant thing now, and then if they're still interested, they can look back at your history up to this point. We're going to list the jobs the same way. So you want to make sure that you include your school name, including the city and state that it was as well. If you got a degree, if it's like an associate or a certificate, you want to say what the degree or certificate was in, and also your graduation year. If you're still in progress, you would just list when you started and your anticipated graduation date. For high school or GED, if you've already completed it, just list the high school and list your year of graduation. Or if you don't want to reveal maybe your age or how old you are, you can just list the school itself without listing your graduation date. Here are a couple examples of what education might look like. You want a little banner at the top to say, hey, this is the education section. And then underneath there, you'll list each school independently from each other. You'll have, if you have a degree from there, the month and year that you got it, you graduated, or the range of dates if you're still currently there. certifications. So just to explain a little bit, certification is going to be something official, usually from like a third party. So it's going to be something like getting a CPR certification or getting, a legal like a legal certificate or um, something official that comes outside of the school usually. So when you finish a program at a college, usually you'll end up with a certificate, which is just saying, hey, you completed these classes at this college, and here's a certificate for passing those classes. Certification is usually going one step beyond that and taking an official test. And so something like a CNA exam with the state of Illinois would be an example of a certification. You can pass your CNA class and get a certificate from Parkland, but it doesn't mean you have a certification from the state. So that's why I like to list this in a separate section. Again, we're going to put you can either put it in most recent to oldest, or what I would recommend is if you have multiple certifications, list the most relevant one first. You want, again, the recruiter is only spending about 6 seconds scanning your resume. So you want the first thing that they see in each category to be the one that gets their attention most. So do the most relevant one first. You're going to want to include the certification name, spell it out, and use the abbreviation for it again, because there's those online scanners, and you want to make sure that you're covering all your bases. So you're spelling out the full name and also the abbreviation name. So if it's looking for only one of those, it scans it for the information that it's looking for. If you have the provider, like where you took the test, facilitator information, you would want to list that as well as the date you received that particular certification. Again, here's some examples of what that might look like, including the name of the certification, where they got it, and the date that it was received. And for the rest of the resume, so the work and other experience is going to take up the vast majority of most people's resume. So we're going to spend a little bit more time on this. And so for your work experience, you're going to want to focus on what you did, the skills you needed to do that job, and the full range of everything that you did within that job. So kind of combining what tasks and skills you did to the fullest extent to really give the person who's reading your resume a full idea of what you did at that specific job. And we're going to do that for each job that you list on here. So again, I'm gonna give examples of reverse chronological. If depending on your situation, it might make more sense to put the thing that is most relevant at the top. So maybe your most recent job or two has nothing to do with where you're trying to go, but a job that you worked 5 years ago and you were there for a long time makes more sense for where you're trying to go to. Maybe it was a healthcare job and you're trying to go back into healthcare after working in an office. Then, maybe you want to put that at the top because it's, hey, I already have 5 years of experience in healthcare. I want them to see that first, even though it might be a little bit older. So you can do that, but it's always safe to go with the reverse chronological because that's what they're used to seeing. You're going to list the employer name. You're going to list your job title. You're going to list the dates that you worked, so the month and year that you started to the month and year that you ended. And if you're still employed, you would just list present instead of an end date. And then underneath that, there's going to be bullet points. So again, here's some examples of what your experience might look like. There's no necessarily right or wrong way to do that, but it is important that whatever you do, it looks neat, clean, and easy to read, and that it's consistent all the way through. Again, this is you putting your best foot forward, and so you want to make sure that everything matches and is formatted the same way throughout your document, because that's proving your attention to pay attention to detail and use computers and all of those things. So even though the information might be the same, how it's presented is going to be, again, part of the things that's considered when they're looking at your application. So what can you add for experience? What have you done? What skills? Think about who's your audience. Each job is looking for a particular skill set, so make sure that what you're writing makes sense for where you're trying to go. Why is it relevant? Again, kind of just because you have experience, experience on its own is good. Having a work history is good, but there's only so much time that they're going to spend looking at your resume. So make sure that the stuff you're putting on there, you're listing the most important stuff first. And if you still have extra space to work with, maybe filling in the gap with some things that are maybe a little bit less relevant. And don't duplicate. Some people have worked, let's say you've worked in retail jobs, for the past 10 years, but you've done it at 4 different places. You don't want to put the same 5 tasks down for all 4 of those jobs. What you want to do is think of what's slightly different that you've done at each job and highlight the difference in responsibilities and tasks and skills that you had to use at each of those jobs. And you can maybe spread out the things that are the same and kind of distribute them evenly between the jobs. So it looks like each one is unique. Each one you had a different skill set that you were working on, and you're not wasting their time by listing the same thing multiple times. If a recruiter sees the same prompts over and over again, they're going to check out and say, oh, there's nothing else important to read here. I'm just going to go to the next one. Again, this is an example of your best work. You are trying to impress the employer to get them to call you for an interview. So if this is your best shot and you have bad punctuation, you don't know how to use present tense for a job you're currently at versus past tense for a job that you used to work at, they're going to notice and they're going to want to, you're going to be judged based on your ability to do that. Not going to necessarily say it's fair, but that is kind of the things that is going through the recruiter's head when they are looking at those things. I highly recommend, if you're not familiar with the idea of using active voice, there's a link here that you can click in the download once this video is done of how to define something into active voice. And so that really grabs your attention. It gets the recruiter's attention. It shows that you're active in the middle of something instead of being a long run-on sentence. And easy to read. So whenever you're writing a bullet point, try to write them in a way that if you left your resume at the bus and some person who had never met you and is never going to see you could read and have a full idea of everything that you did at each of your jobs without having to ask for clarification. That's how you want to write your bullet points. It's easy to read, it's easy to understand, and if someone never knew what, say, a welder did at their job, they would be able to read your resume and understand, oh, okay, I have a good idea of what you did at your job. That's how you want to write your bullet points. Using the same language. So when I say that, I mean, like, look at the job postings. Generally, if you're applying in a certain field and you're looking at numerous job postings, there's going to be some things that are the same across all of the different job listings. Maybe it's customer service, maybe it's the ability to work in a stressful environment, maybe it's having good, compassionate care. Whatever it is, just make sure that you're paying attention at these job listings, because these listings have gone through a screening process in the company, and so they've debated, like, hey, what's the most important things that we need someone for this job? And whatever those list of important things are, that's what makes it to the job listing. So if it's in the job listing, it's important and you should be addressing that in your resume. Don't use a skills section. So skills, if you use some of the things like Indeed Resume Builder, it's going to say, hey, what do you want to put in your skills section? However, anyone can list a long list of skills that they may or may not have. I can say that I'm good at Office, Microsoft Office. I can say I'm good at coding things. I can say that I'm good at physically, with physical tools and problem solving. But without a context of when I've done that in the past, it doesn't mean anything. So really, don't you want to show off your skills, but you want to show them off in the jobs that you've done or the education that you've had, and not just an arbitrary list with no context. Work the skills that you've used into your work experience, because then you're just like, oh, I problem solved this thing at the store where I was, an assistant manager or a trainer, and this is how I solved problems. And then it gives the employer an idea, oh, here's how you've already put that to work. You've done this before already. And it gives them an idea and framework that, oh, you could probably do this here too. A random list of things that you might be good at with no context doesn't do a good job at showing that you're actually capable of doing those. And again, use those keywords, look at the job listings, use the keywords, things like that keep showing up: customer service, attention to detail, time management. What are those hot words that show up in all the bullet points and all the jobs you're looking at? And make sure that you're using that in your resume. So briefly, again, just kind of a recap of keywords. Look at multiple job descriptions, see what overlaps. Are there certain industry certifications that they want you to have? If so, make sure that you're spelling it out the same way it's listed on the job listing. So you might need to change this depending on the job you're applying for, as far as what your experience is. And try to avoid, jargon or buzzwords. So again, the person who's reading your resume may read it for the entire company. The entire company might have 30 different kinds of jobs. So try to keep things like acronyms that might be commonplace in your role, that might not be commonplace outside of your role. Try to limit those. Just because you don't want to use an acronym that not everyone knows, and since they don't know it, they kind of throw it in the trash because they're like, I don't know what that means, and I don't want to take a chance on guessing what it means. Transferable skills. So a lot of people ask me, hey, Jordan, what if I don't have a job that overlaps with where I'm trying to go to? Like, there's nothing that's the same. And I would argue that there's very few jobs where there is no overlap between where you've been and where you're trying to go. Sometimes you just have to think about it a little bit longer to try and make those connections, but almost always there's something there that overlaps. And so, one ways that you can kind of think of that is breaking bullets into skills and tasks. Tasks are going to be kind of what you did, and skills are going to be what enabled you to do those. Uh, and then breaking it down. So, thinking back on the jobs that you've done, I always say people tend to think of too generally, like, oh, all I did was check people out. But when you're new to a job, there's actually multiple steps to checking people out as a cashier. So think of, if you had to train someone who's never done that kind of job before, think of all the individual steps in that process that you have to do, and it'll help give you a better framework and ideas of all the different skills you had to use. If you think of it, hey, I have to train someone who's never done this before, what are all the individual steps I would have to show them? So on here are some example of tasks. Sweeping, mopping floors, checking out guests, taking care of patients, entering data into a computer, answering phone calls or emails, things like that. Example of skills would be ability to communicate well, be able to manage your time well, staying calm in stress, operating by yourself well, problem solving, customer service, positive attitude, attention to detail. These are all skills that enable you to do specific tasks. And so these skills are going to be that carry over between job to job are transferable skills. So the tasks that you do daily might look completely different at a new job, especially if you're switching career fields. But the skills that you use to do what you need to every day, your tasks, might stay the same. You need to have good time management, whether you're in retail or you're a doctor or you're a business executive. You still need to be able to manage your time well to get what you need done. So, the best way to write your bullet points on your resume would be combining your task, the physical things that you did, with the skills and abilities that enabled you to do those things well. So some examples here is, communicated knowledge of store layout to guests. So the task you did was helping guests find things, but you had to communicate with them so that they understood what you were trying to say and where to find those things. So you're employing the skill of communication and combining it with the task, what you physically did, and putting those together, and that makes a great bullet point. So you can look at the rest of these for examples of, a task that you had to do and a skill that enabled you to do that well, and putting those together. On here, there's some more example of a weak bullet point. So for here, it's an events coordinator. So they probably do events of some sort, and they just have one bullet point here: responsible for organizing events and panels. I would say this is a normal kind of thing that I see a lot of people do for the jobs. It's like, oh, all I did was, I just, organized things, or I just put things on the shelf, or all I did was say hi to people when they come in. But that, again, think about the person who's reading it. Does that tell you the full story of everything that you did at that job? Probably not. There's probably some information that you could add that shows off your skills more. So, a better way for this particular person would be break it down. Well, the events probably had a timeline and it had people that showed up. So they're like, hey, they planned panels on health for groups of 25 to 50 people, and they did it every 2 months. They're breaking that down. Uh, Also, they had to identify and contact health professionals in their community to show up to these panels. Likewise, they also had to make marketing materials and publicize events through social media, again, to probably get people to show up to those meetings. So they broke down all the different components of what was just one bullet point here, and they broke it down into individual pieces, and it looks like they have a lot more experience because they do. But they had to stop and think about what are all the different components to what I do on a daily basis here. Some additional tips to kind of keep in mind as you move forward. Again, if you're going into any sort of business, tech, office type environment, highly recommend a LinkedIn profile. And even if not, it never hurts to make one. Over half of employers will look you up on social media. So you might as well kind of curate a spot for them to go to. And you can even include the link on your resumes since most of them are turned in digitally. You can just put the link to your LinkedIn right on your resume. And so they can just go and find you right away. But they might want to do some more research. So they'll probably do a Google search of your name and just, maybe log out or have someone do a Google search of your name or whatever name is on your application materials, see what shows up. Because if anything shows up that they don't like, that's going to give them a reason to not extend an interview, maybe not extend a job offer. So, maybe make sure your profiles are private if you need to do that, or if there is anything public, that it's not anything too strongly political, too strongly associated, maybe with drugs or alcohol, things that might inhibit someone feeling safe, like, hey, do I want this person representing our company? And if the answer is no, then you should probably make sure that nobody outside of, your inner circle be able to see that. And then lastly, follow the instructions. I cannot say how important that is because, again, just the application itself is a test of your ability to follow instructions. If you can't follow basic instructions when you're trying to make your best impression on a company, why would they think that you're going to be good at following instructions once you have the job and it's kind of guaranteed that you're working for them now? So again, if you don't follow the instructions the way it's laid out, that's a red flag for the employer to say, hey, if at your best shot you can't even follow a list of instructions we gave you, like that doesn't look well for someone who we want to work here. We're just going to interview someone else. So again, follow instructions. If you don't know how to follow up with it, reach out to the company and say, hey, I want to make sure I'm doing this right. Is this how I would do that? Also, for some jobs like CNA, for the most part, your job responsibilities are going to be the same no matter what kind of job you apply for. But in IT or office work or something along those lines, what you do on the job day to day might vary a little bit. You might be more of a customer facing position where you're on phones and email all day. You might be more on the side of doing help tickets in email or fixing problems or entering in data. And so that resume is going to look different than the one that's primary customer facing. So if you need to, edit your resume to highlight the skills you have for where you're trying to go. And so, maybe think about having one resume like, hey, this is my customer service resume. This is my data entry resume, something like that, because that's going to give you a better response than sending the same resume out to 100 different people. Also, again, first impressions are a huge part of moving on in the process. So when you're done, I highly recommend you print out whatever your application materials are and try and scan it for typos. I always find typos once I find something printed out. And I would also recommend after you fix those typos, have someone else read it. See if they can find typos because you know what's going on in your head. So your brain kind of automatically fills in gaps sometimes that other people will be like, who aren't in your head, will be like, hey, why you're missing a word here? Or you have two words here. Like you should change that. So always proofread and ideally have someone else proofread it too. Again, with following instructions, file formats are important. Usually you can just turn in a Microsoft Word document, but every now and then they might ask, hey, we want you to turn in a PDF, or we want you to turn in all of your application materials on the same document. We want your resume and references on one document instead of two separate ones. So again, make sure you're reading the instructions and you know how to change those things if you need to. Yeah, and discrimination, while it's illegal, can still happen. People have in unconscious or conscious biases. So just be aware of the information that you present can be used for or against you, like having your name, your birth year, and your email address when you graduated high school. Whether or not your name sounds like you were born in America or not, whether or not it's fair, just be aware that these are some things that. And if you have any work experience that's outside of the US, one of the things that an employer is probably going to want to know is, are you legally allowed to work in the US? So sometimes on the online application itself, there will be a spot, are you eligible to work in the US with or without a visa? And so you can usually answer that on the employer's application process itself. But if after finishing the whole application, um, that isn't asked, you might want to make a note of it on your resume, just because it's a question they might have if you don't have, U.S. work experience. So just keep that in mind. And then I took online Reddit, so online forum called Reddit, and just kind of looked up of some hiring recruiters who gave some advice of the companies that they work with and their advice for someone trying to make a successful application to somewhere. So again, at the top, so it's not just me saying it, target your resume. Do it for the specific job you're applying for. Pay attention to your keywords, in the next bullet. Incorporate the keywords in job postings. Show how that acronym is knowledge, skills, abilities, um, and objectives match the job. So show all of those things, your knowledge, your skills, your abilities, your objectives, and how those line up with the job you're applying for. Again, generic resumes don't catch the eye of the recruiter. Use action verbs. So again, using that active voice is going to be very helpful. And again, for that job scanning piece, it's going to help you. You don't have to list everything at every job that you've ever listed at. Be targeted. If you left a job on not the greatest circumstances, you don't have to list that job on your resume. So I've been let go from a job in the past, or actually rather asked to resign, and I've never listed that job on my resume, and that's fine. They don't need to know that 10 years ago I chose to leave a job that I was not good at and realized was a bad fit for me. So, keep in mind what you want to list and that you're not required to list anything specifically on your resume if you don't want to. Always send to the document itself. Don't send a screenshot of anything. So if you have a resume, send it to the document, not a screenshot of your computer screen or something from your phone. Next bullet point, again, make sure all your spacing looks nice. Make sure everything matches. If your resume is your best work and it's sloppy, it shows that you're not trying hard, that you're not putting your best effort into it, and they're not going to really think that you actually want to be a good employee once you're there. And then at the bottom, it kind of talks into some email names that are excellent examples of what not to put on your resume. So again, try to stick with some version of your name. You can put a number in there, but again, I would maybe stay away from things that could be construed as a birth year, because again, it's giving free information that could be used potentially to disqualify you from that job. And in the attachment, you will also have access to these links that I pulled some of the information from this presentation on.